what I'm going to focus on primarily is box joinery, but something that caught Brian's eye and something caught my eye. It's a three-way miter. And I'll show you what that is in a moment. Well, I'll show you now. If you can see that, does that show up okay? It's banding or edging on a box that comes in from 3 directions. So maybe that's easier.
You might want to bring it.
But I'll show you in more detail.
Over here.
I'll show you more detail later. So it's like a craft show here. I've got all these boxes out here. Those of you who know me or have been in the club for a while know that I've become a box maker primarily. I do a lot of other things, but box making has become the mode for a lot of my expression in woodworking these days. And I like it because I never make the same box twice. All the boxes I've made have all been individual and different. And there's so much involved in making even the simplest box. It's quite a bit of woodworking. Takes quite a bit of skill and technique. You can practice a lot of different techniques with boxes, with sometimes the simplest boxes. So I have arranged here a number of boxes that I wanted to show for a particular reason. And that is that the tops of these are all functioning in somewhat different ways. This is a simple box that has a drop-in top, simple flat top. It just drops in the box, and there's a lip on the inside to hold it in place. Very simple. And another simple top is just to make your box, cut it in half, and then put a liner on the inside that acts to register the top and hold the top in place. Also, a very simple design. There are other kinds that hinge with various kinds of hinging, simple strap hinges here. This is the kind that Barry showed me how to make. These are kind of barrel hinges. There's a YouTube video that Barry made and that we can get the address from Brian to show you how to make those kinds of cuts with those hinges. But the tops, I want to focus on the tops. The tops with these show a kind of an evolution. With the top on this one, what I've done is simply taken and made a groove on the inside of the sides, on the top inside, and dropped the top in, gluing on the edges, and just drop it in. This one, the top on this one, being veneered, is captured. It's captured within the top. So that's the example. With this one I'm going to show later tonight, the final one that I'll do more detail, the one I'm working on now, it's captured, the top is captured with a groove and tongue so that the top is level with the sides. Is that clear? So different types of tops. When I started doing veneer work with this type of top, for this kind of box, where I dropped it in, it got to be awfully difficult to make it so exact that there weren't small, sightly gaps in between the top and the sides. So a way of overcoming those gaps in this box, for example, was to make an edging around the top. And making the edging around the top I think gives it a nice clean look, but it has the extra advantage of also cleaning up any of those gaps. You can hardly see any gap there at all, which I like. So I came across an old Woodsmith copy that I had in my collection that talks about making jewelry boxes with three-way miters. Here you can see it again, an example. And I thought, that's interesting. I've never made a three-way miter. I wonder if I could do that. It also has the advantage that there is a new technique I hadn't tried, for me, new technique I hadn't tried before, and that's joining the sides with splines. And I'll show you in a minute in more detail what I mean. That's something I hadn't done before. I have done sides that join the simple kind of butt joints, essentially, and also with, I did a lot with keyed miters, miter keys. That's a simple process, actually, with a sled. But I liked this one. I'll show you an example here. I liked this because you can see the spline going all the way the length of the corner sides. And there's really nothing very much to that, but it's something I hadn't done before, and so I thought I'd try it, along with the three-way miter. So I want to go through the basic steps here. I don't want to spend a lot of time with it, but I want to go through the basic steps of making a box and preparing it to the stage, to this stage, where I'm going to put the three-way mitered edging. So of course, the first thing with a box, choose your materials. They should ideally contrast nicely and be harmonious in color. But you need, first of all, to take your board that you want to make your box out of and mill it to the desired thickness, which in my case is 1/2 inch. And then, of course, cut it to the width that you want to have, or the height, that is, that you want to have your box. In the case of the box I'm working on now, it's just a little over 3.5 inches high. And the thickness 1/2 inch. I think 1/2 inch works better. Some of the stuff I've done before have been a little too thick, I think. So 1/2 inch works well. Okay, let me bring that out. I have 2 boxes in process, and this is one that I'm making out of, I don't know if any of you know this, Morado. It's a South American wood, beautiful, deep brown, rich wood. But this will help me illustrate the steps in making the box, the way I make it. This kind of box with the spline miter joints. Start off with your piece. Mill it to size. Sand it on the inside. You'll have an opportunity to sand it on the outside later after it's put together. But once you glue up the box, you're not going to be able to get into the inside very easily. So it's a good idea to sand it up at this stage. then the next thing to do is to cut the miters. And for that, there are several ways to do it, really, but I think the best way for me has been to use a crosscut sled. The most recent issue of Tools and Chops issue of Fine Woodworking has an example in there of Michael Pekovich, I believe. He has a whole series of sleds that he's created, one of them being for cutting these kinds of miters. A little more elaborate than the one I have, which is here. Just a basic sled, nothing complicated at all, but with a 45 degree, to accommodate a 45 degree blade. And then of course, it has runners on the bottom that run into in the miter gauge runners. So then the next thing, after I've cut these, all of these, one of the key things is with boxes can be awfully finicky. They got to be exact. You want to have the sides be absolutely dead on. If they're not quite dead on with each other, if one is slightly longer than the other, these being the ends, if they're not exactly dead on the same length, it has a way of multiplying itself, that problem, and makes your corners, when you join your corners together, the last two, they're somewhat out of line. And your eye will see that. So it's very important that these pieces be the exact same length, as well as being perfect 45 degree miters. And I've just bought a tool that I'm just starting to use and that I'm finding is really quite wonderful for this. It's this guy here. I'm sure you all know what this is. Anybody not know what this is? Called a miter trimmer. And it's really it's a guillotine affair. Very heavy. And you can set your sides in all the way up to almost 3 3/4 inches. And then it shaves off a very thin slice. It literally is a razor cut right on the edge, and it cuts it dead on 45 degrees. You can also set the fence here to 90 degrees, but it will cut dead on 45 degrees, eliminates a lot of frustration. All right, the next step then is, once I've got these 4 pieces, the ends and the sides, I've got them cut to size, they're trimmed to be exact. Then what I want is to make the channels here for my splines. And then, you know, in the article, it says, you know, take 1/8 inch stock and make your splines. Well, okay, how do I do that? It's easier said than done, but there are some tricks. So first of all, you want to cut the groove. And to cut the groove, you set it up against your fence on your table saw and set the blade, excuse me, at 45 degrees, at a 45-degree angle. Then you want to sneak up on the depth of that cut. You want that cut to be, first of all, right in the middle, or pretty much in the middle of this surface, but also not too deep. Because if you go too deep, this becomes very weak. So it has to be deep enough. And I suggest, in this case, just setting your blade ever so slightly higher until you reach the desired depth. In my case, it was a 1/4 inch because I'm going to be using splines in it that are a 1/2 inch. So I was just saying, well, how do you make these splines? How do you get 1/8 inch thick stock to make them? Well, this is where double-sided tape comes into play. Double-sided tape is just so wonderful, carpet tape, because you can hold it on a sled, on a piece like this. Take your piece, glue it down on it, and then you can run it through your planer until you come up and you can dial it in until you get exactly the depth that you want, 1/8 inch of an inch in this case. So using the carpet tape, double-sided tape, if you don't know that trick yet, I presume most of you do, but it's really very helpful. There's one other thing to worry about with these splines. They have to be, the splines have to be with the grain running across them, not this direction. Because it'll bend and break if it's in the wrong grain direction. One way, you can see it here. One way, this is with the grain, it bends very easily. But across the grain, you can't bend it. And that strength is what gives the integrity to your splines. Gives them the strength to hold these sides together. So here's what I've come up with. And the splines will give it strength and reinforcement all the way around. If I have my piece here, the way I cut out the splines, 1/2 inch, was simply on the chop saw. I just cut them on the chop saw, being quite careful in the process. Then, the next part of the box involves the top and the bottom. In this particular model, remember when I first talked about the tops, how I was putting the tops in, and I want to put the tops in using this arrangement, where a tongue is captured in the groove. To do that, I need to cut this groove on the sides and on the ends. It's only 1/8 of an inch deep, and yes, it's only 1/8 of an inch deep and 1/4 of an inch wide. So the top also receives a dado like that, the bottom bends. And fits in together like that. But here the key is, this top and this bottom are going to be veneered in the end. They're going to be veneered. And to get that veneer to sit flat on the box, here again, this has to be quite precise. The way I have it is this piece is already a little bit proud. I'm going to have to put it through my planer and take off about a 32nd of an inch. So it sits exactly in line with the top edge or the bottom edge. One thing about this design with a drop-in top, this top can be very thin. So if you're doing something with veneer, you can use a 1/4 inch MDF and veneer both sides and drop it in there. With this design, that won't work because your tongue will be too small. So this works better with plywood or MDF that's 1/2 inch. You gonna get the dog? Toby's going crazy. So with the top and the bottom for this design, I end up veneering the inside of the top and the inside of the bottom. When the box is then assembled, when it is all assembled, I will take and put a sheet of veneer over the top of this, press it down using cawls, so that I will have a beautiful veneer top. And let me just show you, because what I'm using is a veneer called okume, and it's pretty spectacular. Let me show you. You can see the flames and the color in this. It's really quite stunning, I think, called okume. And what I will do is I will cut it slightly oversized, put it on the top when the box is assembled, and then press it down. When it then dries, I'll take a utility knife and cut it to the size of the top, exactly to the size of the top. And what I was saying before about the top having to be exactly in line with the edges, because with veneer, if you have a somewhat wavy, unstable substrate, it will loosen and won't adhere very well. So it needs there should be no gaps either. If you're using a piece of plywood that has some gaps or some voids, whatever, no matter how small, what you need to do is to fill those with wood putty and then sand it all down really smooth. So I think that veneer is just going to be the ticket. So at this point, once this is all together like this, the top and the bottom, and the veneer has been attached. On the bottom of this, I could also put a veneer, but the article suggests putting a leather bottom, using Napa leather for the bottom, which I may or may not do. I'm not yet decided.
Hello.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Yeah, happy dog.
Oh, the dog? So anyway,
just to inform you what the woods are again, this is Morado, this wood. It's the first time I've ever used it, but it's also called Pau Ferro or Bolivian rosewood. It works beautifully, polishes up extremely nicely. It's nice hard wood and has a very luscious, deep luster, deep brown luster. The inside of the bottom is just a dyed black veneer. I think it's probably poplar, some simple wood, not expensive wood. And on the inside, this is holly, an American holly. That will look nice, I think, very much when the box is opened. You'll have that bright color, nice contrast. What I haven't decided is for the trim, what kind of wood to use for the trim on this box, for the edging. I'm going to want to use something, I think, that contrasts nicely with that okume veneered top and with the Morado, dark Morado. So one thing I'm thinking of doing is using rhododendron. I harvested some rhododendron branches several years ago. They were fairly thick. They won't yield much lumber, of course, but I think they would yield enough, and I could put it through my planer to get rhododendron for my edging, which is almost like holly. It's very hard, works extremely well. So I may be using rhododendron. All right, now we're going to move on to the main focal point of the evening, and that is making this edging and then cutting the three-way miters. So let me put this one away. So let's talk about making, first of all, let's talk about making these 1/4-inch square pieces that will go around the edges, all 8 edges, actually all 12 edges. 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom, and then 4 on the corners. Again, this is where carpet tape comes in extremely handy. Start off by taking your pieces, running them through your planer to size, to 1/4 inch, and then take that and cut it into strips like this. Oversized is somewhat oversized, maybe a 1/16 or so oversized. Then to get it to be perfectly square, like this piece here, we will take these pieces and stack them together, press them down on the carpet tape. The carpet tape will hold them really nicely, and then just, again, run them through your planer, being very careful that you don't go down too far, but it's the best way that I know of, the simplest and most accurate way, other than hand planing, which was not something I could quite do to the finesse that's necessary here. But it's a very simple and effective way to make your edging. But of course, the edging has to go into grooves on all these edges and on the corners. This is perhaps the most finicky part of the whole project, because you want to cut your channels here, your rabbets here, on the router table, but you have to be very careful when cutting these that you don't get chip out. Chip out is the big enemy, because you run it across your router with your bit below it, and you are likely to get chip out if you're not really careful. So let me bring over this thing here to sort of demonstrate how this is done. I hope you can see this. It's a little small. But the way you avoid chip out with this is you want to, first of all, there are basically 3 steps, maybe 4 steps. You want to, first of all, make some scoring passes. That is, you will set your straight bit, in this case a 1/2 inch straight bit, in your router table, and you want to just make a very shallow 1/4 inch deep, and maybe even a 1/16 or a 32nd even, scoring pass. So you set your box not up against the fence. This represents the fence right here of the routing table. And you start off with your bottom face. You run your bottom face first with an auxiliary fence behind your mortar gauge. When you're pushing your box through with the mortar gauge, have an auxiliary fence behind it. That will help prevent some of the chip out. So you make that scoring face with the bottom scoring cut. Using the bottom face first, flip it over, do the exact same thing with the top face. And what you end up with after those 2 steps, you end up with something like this, with a little shallow cut here and a little shallow cut there. Then you move your box all the way over to the fence. Here there was a little gap, but you want to bring it all the way over to the fence now to cut your full 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch rabbet. There are 2 other steps. So one of them is do scoring cuts first and use an auxiliary fence behind it. Those are 2 steps. The 3rd step is the sequence in which you cut these channels, these rabbets. It's important for avoiding chip out that you follow a particular sequence. You want to route the shortest edges first. You can see this is going across the grain. It's basically a cross cut on this. It's going to chip out on this end over here. But since you're going to be putting, it's likely to anyway, but since you're going to be putting another channel this way, you can erase that chip out if you go with the corners first. So you want to cut your corners, all 4 of your corners first. Then you want to cut the next shortest, these. Cut these next. These are the end pieces, the end rabbets on both ends. And then finally, Finally, you'll cut your long channels. So the corner channels first, end channels second, side channels last. By the way, this is a box that I'm basically using as a practice box. As I said before, I haven't made, in fact, this was the very first and only to this point three-way miter I've tried. So this is a practice box. It has some difficulties, you'll see. I'm not going to point them out, but it does have some difficulties. So it's going to be a practice box. It might interest you to know what woods I'm using here. This is curly maple. And some bird's eye. It's beautifully figured maple, which, by the way, this and the Murado I got from Rare Woods in Maine. Their wood is expensive, but they have exquisite wood. And if you're making something small like a box, I think it's worth the investment. If I were making a big piece of furniture out of Murado at, I don't know, $12, $13 at least a board foot, probably much more, then I would think twice about buying it from there. But if you want to use unusual woods, Rare Woods in Mexico, Maine is a great place to get it from. So anyway, this burl here, which by the way, the burl I got from a place in East Aurora, New York called Certain Woods. You can buy them online. They have also a fantastic selection of just lovely, lovely veneers. This particular one is called a Pellin burl. Jim Morgan will know what that is because he's used it, with holly and black dyed poplar stripes around it to accent it, and just simple oak veneer on the bottom. So what I've done so far is we've gotten to the point we've assembled the box, put it all together to this point, and now we're going to add our banding on the sides. I wanted to show you this off too, because this is going to come into play in a moment. This was a project I've done just recently. Great to be retired, I must say. But I'm using a lot of tape in these veneering projects. And I always have to go find the tape, cut it down, put it on my bench, score it, so I have it cut. And I thought, why don't I make a little caddy for my tape? So I went online, found a YouTube video, and this is what I came up with. So, to put I guess we need to cut these first. Before we mount them, we have to cut them. This is your one of three pieces to form the three-way miter. You'll see that it is cut at an angle and then turned over and cut again at an angle in such a way that there is a point. It comes to a point, and the line between the faces, left and right, aligns exactly with this line here. So you cut two equal cuts on both sides at 45 degrees. And then when you have three of those, first of all, two go together like that, two go together like that, and there is one more here. Here it is. And the third one will come, whoops. You can show it to you this way. And the third one will then come in and form, hopefully, a nice, snug corner. But before we get there, we've got our edging pieces. And by the way, you need a lot of them, a lot more than you think you would need. And it's always good to have some extra. But first of all, we have to cut these ends. How do we do that? There are a couple ways to do it. I like this little bench hook here. It works very well and is actually quite accurate, surprisingly accurate. And using my crosscut fine tooth, 16 teeth per inch, I line it up. And cut it across. Then I give it a half turn, quarter turn actually, and then I'm going to see if I can get a pencil to show you. Then I'm going to cut another miter across from this point to this point, that diagonal across. Actually, no, I want to go this way. I want to go this way, from this point to that point. So I want to go the opposite direction. And cut it this way. The other tool I can use for this, since it's quite fine, is this small little gadget here. Small little miter box. And there, I've got it. It's pretty close. But again, if I wanted to be spot on and very close, I would go back to my miter trimmer again and use that to cut it off. The miter trimmer, the beauty of it, those of you who haven't used one, is that it cuts very, very fine shavings. And it slices the wood. It doesn't really saw the wood. It just slices it across the grain so that what you're ending up with is a very smooth face. They use them, I'm sure you've seen them, they use them a lot in making picture frames and those kinds of things, but they're an extremely useful tool in box making as well. So there's nothing much to it. Again, I will take my edging and cut across this way, then turn it and cut across the other way so that I have a point. And ideally, the edge here should line up directly with the point so that there is one line all the way through. Then you're spot on. before you glue them up and you put them together and glue them up, they recommend in the article, and sadly, I think the article is not signed. They don't give the people any credit when they wrote those articles. Anyway, what they suggest is taking some sandpaper and just relieving this inside corner a little bit. That will form a little gap when your three come together for the glue to settle in. So.
Running out of juice.
So I just cut this one. The next finicky thing about this is you want to line up all of these pieces so that they meet exactly in the corner with no gap and no piece longer than the other piece. So to do that, to set it in correctly, the first thing you should do is to take a practice piece or a test piece. Take a test piece and then make sure it's dead on the corner. Another test piece. And here again, you want to be as precise as you can be. And tape it in place. That gives it a place, my first piece that's actually going to be glued in, it gives it a place to be registered against. Then over here again, it's critical that your piece be the exact length from this corner to this corner. It has to be exact. Here again, there's wisdom in sneaking up on it. Can we get this way? I'm watching it out. Move this over. Okay. The other thing is it's kind of easy to get confused. Which direction is which? So when you find that point, just mark it this way and mark it again back this way. So I'll go back to my I'm making this a bit long. Now that's kind of rough. That doesn't look so good. But I think it's going to be pretty long anyway. So what I want to do now, yes. It's also backwards, I think. Yes. This should be cutting this way. You can see how easy it is to get confused on that. If this happens, then save this piece, and you can use it for the other sides. So let's go back again. Here was a long piece. No, I better not mess it up this time. I want to cut down that way. Good, good. Now to see if I'm right, I want to take another test piece and put it in here. And if you can get in on that, Janet, I don't know how well you can see that, but there is a gap here. This does not align exactly because this piece here is a little long. So I need to shave it just a hair. I'm going to take this guy out again. And I flip it over. Oh, that one's nice. And it's very crisp. So we'll put that in. And it's right where I want it to be. I will go all the way around with this now. And because of time constraints, I'm not going to do that and glue it all in. I'm just going to tape these in. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting close. So I've got this to this point. And you can imagine that I've got my edging around on all of the outside edges, except for the corners. I'm now going to come in and cut my remaining pieces that would fit into the corners. I said before, this is a test box. Here I've got some chip out, which when I put this together like that, there I go straight to it. So it's a test box. But I think you can see how beautifully snug the pieces come together to form the three-way miter. And it's no more complicated than that. This piece will, it doesn't rest up against anything because you have pieces coming in this way, so it has to drop in exactly the length that you want. Again, what you do to reach that, get that exactitude, to get it precise, is you need to sneak up on it. You make your cuts the way you made all the other cuts, make them a little long, and then gradually just shave a little bit off each time, just a little bit off, until it fits right where you want it to fit. Then, when you've got them all done, you can glue them in as you go sequentially. You glue that final 4 pieces in, and you end up with something like this. And it has a nice feature too on the inside. I really like that contrast. The box, of course, is not finished. Once you've got all the edging around, you have to cut it open. And for cutting it open, there's one thing I would suggest doing. Most of you probably know when you're cutting something open, a box open like this, that you set your blade. Say you want to cut the box pretty close to 1/3. You set your blade on your table saw so that it's just beyond the width of the wood you're cutting. So this is 1/2 inch. I would set it maybe at 5/8 and run the short sides through first. Then what you do is you put a couple of pieces in the kerf, and you tape it so it can't move. And then you run the long cuts. But even then, when you've got the pieces in there, the splines in there to hold it, and the tape and the kerf, I found over the years that it's very delicate to make those cuts on the table saw when the ends are already cut through and you run it through this way. It's no matter how hard you steady it, it's very easy when you get to the very end of it to wobble it a little bit, and then you've got an unsightly gap. So to counteract that, what I do is I set my blade up just a hair under a 1/2 inch, so I don't cut all the way through the box. Only on the long pieces, on the long cuts. I cut a hair under a 1/2 inch, and then I take my utility knife and cut open the box. That prevents it from wobbling and getting that unsightly gap. Cut the box open with my utility knife, trim it with a block plane, and then rope it around, move it around on a piece of sandpaper that has been spray adhesive to a flat surface, maybe the top of my workbench, until it's nice, smooth, and smooth all the way around. So you don't want to be left with gaps anywhere, particularly around the back, both sides. You just don't want to have gaps. Then there are various ways that you can make a little pull to be able to lift the box. You also have to work on deciding what kind of hinges you want. This is the first time I've used these rail hinges. They work great. You see them a little on the back, but I think they are superb. I got these from Woodcraft. They're not hard to put in. You need a particular 7/16 diameter router bit, but with that, it's an easy setup, and it's spot on. It's really accurate, which I like. As opposed to putting these simple little flap hinges in, which is, I don't know if other people have this difficulty. It is very hard to get them exact so that your pieces measure precisely without any gaps. Well, I've talked for over an hour, I think. And there's a lot more that I could say, but I've really covered most of what I wanted to cover. And I've talked about the three-way miter here. Don't be afraid of it. It's actually pretty easy to do. The hardest part, the edging and cutting those three-way miters is not hard. The hardest part is cutting the channels, not getting chipped out. So that's my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions on how to do the trimming if you don't have a fancy pants miter trimmer?
What was the question? What was? Let me come around that way, and then I can see you face to face. Thank you, Janet, for doing
Let's see, I don't know how to flip it now.
Yeah.
There. Okay.
There we go. There you go. Thanks, Janet. A round of applause for Janet here. A round of applause for Janet.
Yay. Very good. Nice job.
Nice job, Janet.
So what was the question, Brian? Or Ned, who asked it?
If you didn't have the fancy pants cutter, the trimmer, the miter trimmer,
Yep.
how would you go about that?
Well, the catalog, the magazine showed the maker using a crosscut sled and cutting it with a miter sled. And they're kind of delicate. That's the problem. They're kind of delicate. So you want to go carefully with them, and you want to set everything up fairly precisely. In fact, quite precisely. I think if you have a nicely tuned chop saw, you could even do it with a nicely tuned chop saw. The thing with chop saws, I think they can be extremely useful and helpful and accurate. But what you need to do with them is the insert, where the blade comes down, the insert, you need to use a zero clearance insert and you can make those replace the plastic ones that are there. Do you know what I'm saying? On the bed of the chop saw, when you bring down the blade, it goes through this plastic piece. It needs to be, there needs to be no gap there. You need to make your own insert, then bring your saw down so that the kerf matches the blade and there's no gap in between. If you do that, you can make some awfully fine cuts with a chop saw. Even something like this, I would think. Or you could be, really skilled and talented and just do it by hand with this thing here. Whoops. with the what's it called again? With this little miter box. It's like a bench hook miter box. That works too, and that gets pretty accurate.
A crosscut sled with a very thin curved blade would give you a fairly smooth cut as well, right, on the table saw?
It would. And again, I think if you guys subscribe, or anybody subscribes to Fine Woodworking, the current issue, Tools and Chops, it has in there a plan for a really finely tuned and finely made mitering crosscut sled that Michael Pekovich has designed. Now, I haven't built it, I haven't used it, I haven't seen it in action, but I believe it would probably be very accurate, even for small pieces like this.